Welcome back to another episode of the Health Mastery Show. Today I have on with me Alan Flanagan. Alan, like myself, is from Dublin, but at the moment he is doing his PhD at the University of Surrey in England. Alan puts out a lot of great content. I've been following him for about a year or so now online, and most of the stuff that he puts out is with regards to, say, public health or just general health, rather than, say, bodybuilding or sports or physique enhancement. However, we had a great conversation today about some of the things that bodybuilders or recreational bodybuilders, people who just want to improve their body composition, don't necessarily think about when it comes to health. Some people tend to use that word interchangeably, like weight training or bodybuilding and then health, and it's not necessarily always the case. And sometimes people who are trying to enhance their physiques, even if you're not using like drugs or anything like that, kind of miss the forest for the trees when it comes to health, and aren't always in the best position in terms of setting up their diet for long-term health. So that's what we kind of talk about today. It's a really interesting conversation with Alan, and I hope you enjoy it. If you do enjoy the podcast, please do leave a rating and review, but I won't take too much more of your time. Let's get into the podcast with Alan Flanagan. So Alan, my man, thank you for joining the podcast today.
Thanks for having me, Adam. Delighted to be here eventually.
Yeah, it's great. You're the first person from Dublin to have on the podcast, and the second Irish person.
Right. Okay. So there's some milestone.
Yeah, it's a milestone. Yeah. So first of all, congratulations on hooking up with that sounds a bit weird, but getting with hooking up with Danny Lennon.
Yeah.
But no, after the nightclub. But joining forces with Sigma Nutrition.
Yeah.
You're now the Chief Science Officer.
That's it.
And I've been following you for, I don't know, maybe 2 years or so at this stage. And I found you first through social media. I think a friend of mine just said, oh, have a look at this guy's story or something. I can't remember what you were talking about specifically on that day. But I think the thing that I really like about your kind of content and that you put out is that you're obviously very intelligent. You're currently studying. You're currently doing your PhD. I'll let you introduce yourself in a second, but just as giving you my perception. But you're obviously a very smart individual, but you don't beat people with the stick of science. So that's something that I really hate. So you'll often get like people like personal trainers or whatever, they do this to the general public and say, oh, you're so stupid, you think that sugar is going to make you fat, it's all about calories. But You can take a next step up, and I've even seen people who have like doctorates in nutrition science or training or exercise science who'll do the same to like the people who are just maybe not as smart as they are, and explain these things and essentially trying to confuse people, just to show how smart they are and say, well, here's the answer, and I've confused you because I'm smarter than you, now I'm right and I'm the guru. And it's almost like a Charles Poliquin thing, like he used to do, where he used to just make something really complex so that you'd be confused and be like, well, I don't really know what he's talking about, but he sounds smart, so everything
it must be right. Yeah, because it's so high abstract and sounds so complicated, it must be correct, and I must be dumb enough if I can't understand it, that kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly.
That really frustrates me.
I think that's something that you don't do, so that's why I really appreciate it, because
I definitely try not to. There are some movements or some kind of individuals in nutrition that I definitely take aim at, but for the general public, for science communication, my big problem with what you've just described is the fact that when a lot of the people that engage in that kind of like bashing of, oh, you're an idiot because this meta-analysis showed this or this RCT showed this, and I'm looking at them going, do you even know how a meta-analysis can be flawed? Or are you just saying it's evidence because it's on the top of this pyramid that you think actually reflects the quality of a study? So what I find amusing / also frustrating about people that do that is, it's so clear to me that they actually don't really have a lot of scientific literacy, because they're always relying on the design of a trial or a study as the stick to beat people with. But that's clearly showing that they don't really have a grasp of science and a level of scientific literacy that allows them to explain to those people why that study says it, what it does, or what they say it does, and show people how it says that. So what I try and do, certainly with Instagram, and it's why I use Instagram and not Twitter, because with the story kind of format on Instagram, is I try and show people if it's a particular study or a particular research question, try and show them via the kind of the actual studies themselves how X is X, and how these studies confirm or show that X is X, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, and we can talk a little bit about that. I think you've done some work specifically around digging up some flaws within some research on saturated fats. I know on your website you've done your kind of your membership website. But first, would you like to introduce yourself to the people listening to how you got into this? I know you didn't start off in the area of nutrition, but you now are doing a PhD, right?
Yeah, so I had a bit of a random kind of route into nutrition, where I started out as someone, I was always interested in nutrition in the way that I think a lot of us get interested in it, which is through some sort of sport. And I played rugby all through school, and I kind of was always interested in nutrition, maybe giving me some sort of extra edge. And I got quite interested in bodybuilding and just weightlifting when I was about kind of 15, 16. And for most of my late teens and early 20s, I kind of trained like a bodybuilder and played rugby. So I found kind of rugby specific training boring. I enjoyed training, following kind of more bodybuilding style principles and programs. So nutrition was always there as an interest, but in terms of my academic interests, it was kind of always more the humanities. So I did English and history in college, and then I did law after that. And then I started working as a barrister in Dublin, and I stayed in that profession for 9 years. But during that period, I was kind of asking questions about whether it was really what I wanted to do with the rest of my life, kind of thing. You know, a midlife crisis at 25 is always good. And I had always loved nutrition, and I thought, why not try and do something, at least some sort of study in this area, and see where it goes and see if I like it. And so what started out as just basically keeping my brain active and doing something for academic interest, over the course of my master's really developed into something extra. And by the time I was finishing the master's, I had really been bitten by the research bug. I loved the idea of doing science and being in research. And then I got an opportunity at the end, after I'd finished my MSc, from one of the professors at Surrey to jump on board a full-time PhD project in nutrition. And that was it. So I jumped at that opportunity, and a year and a bit later, here I am in the second year of my PhD.
So what are you currently doing your PhD in? It's around chrononutrition, right?
So it's chrononutrition. Yeah, we're looking at timing of food intake and the relationship between circadian rhythms and your metabolism. And so last year we did a forced jet lag study, where we're really trying to tease out, the kind of effects of delaying your meal timing and your sleep timing by, say, 5 hours, and what effect that has on your blood glucose levels, your insulin, and your triglycerides, and also things like energy expenditure is one of the main kind of outcomes we're looking at, and seeing if there's some sort of effect on energy expenditure, or your thermic effect of feeding in response to meals. So that was last year, and we're kind of crunching the data now and starting to look at starting to analyze the blood samples. So we should be pulling together a pretty full data set on that in the next couple of months, which is exciting. And then my big aim for this year is to do a second study looking at the effect of dietary protein intake during the biological night as a potential strategy for night shift workers. So there's a lot of research that looks at kind of carbohydrate and fat metabolism during the biological night. 1, 2, 3, 4 a.m. is really impaired. But if you look at some of the sports nutrition literature, there's a lot of research looking at overnight protein feeding as a strategy to maintain muscle protein synthesis. And you had a proof in concept study from Luc van Loon's research group in Holland that did a nasogastric feeding study. So they were constantly infusing amino acids into people's digestive tract while they were asleep. And they found that there was complete amino acid digestion at night. So it suggests that for dietary protein, you do actually absorb it at night. Now, the caveat there is these people were asleep and not awake. So you get the negative effects of just like being awake during the night as well with shift work. But from that body of research, I've kind of formed a hypothesis that actually if you focused on protein-rich snacks that were low in kind of total calories, but low in carbohydrate and fat. So like a non-fat Greek yogurt, for example, and those kind of foods, and you had them at say 1 a.m. and 4 a.m. or whatever the snack times are during the night, then you might get a less negative impact on your blood glucose levels and your blood lipids. And maybe you might also have the kind of satiating effect of protein carry over into the following day. So you're not as likely to kind of potentially succumb to, some of the overeating that is really common with sleep deprivation or sleep curtailment. So that's my hypothesis. I'm just hoping to do a pilot study to get some proof and concept data for that. But yeah, so fingers crossed. I should be able to pull that off sometime before the end of this calendar year.
Yeah, that sounds very interesting. I can picture you in a couple of years' time with some contraption, or like a Mr. Olympia bodybuilder with the tube up his nose,
right? Yeah,
so
constant amino acid infusion.
Yeah. No, I remember when I was younger. I used to watch like these bodybuilder videos of like the Mr. Olympias, like Jay Cutler, and he like they'd wake up like 2 times a night to have a shake, so that they keep. It's crazy to think about that. Like even though it probably did increase muscle protein synthesis, like the negative impact it would have because of the amount of times that you would wake up and then try to get back to sleep, which is a good segue into the topic that we want to talk about, and that's kind of the dumb stuff or the irrational stuff that bodybuilders do. Now, I know that you're not necessarily a bodybuilder. You said you did bodybuilding training, but I remember you used to post quite a bit about powerlifting. You're a powerlifter, right?
Yeah, I'm still in powerlifting. I just, as my kind of social media evolved, I just, it was never going to be a powerlifting account anyway, so I just kind of stopped posting about my mediocre powerlifting journey. Yeah.
Well, anybody who's not a bodybuilder is at least an aspiring bodybuilder.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
But yeah, so I like to have people on the podcast who kind of are in the trenches almost, like, so they're not just a doctor or studying something, but don't say do any kind of resistance training, so at least they have that element or aspect of it as well.
Right.
But with regards to things that bodybuilders do, and when I say bodybuilders, we kind of spoke a bit off air on this, and I'm talking really about people who are into, say, improving their body composition.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think some of the, say, irrational things that people do that don't really make sense from a nutritional standpoint? And the first thing that I can kind of think of, we talked about this, is thinking that saturated fat will increase your testosterone levels. So is that actually true? And then what's the issue with actually trying to increase proactively your saturated intake? Because I know that maybe it's not so big anymore, but it definitely was a couple of years ago, like buttered coffee, like bulletproof coffee or coconut oil. And I had some friends who would literally just like leather their food in saturated fats.
Right. So the first thing in terms of this kind of correlation between saturated fat and testosterone, I think that was some sort of, I'm not sure where that actually comes from. I think a lot of practices and ideas that take hold in nutrition take hold because of these kind of like ideas people put together, right? And there's a lot of so for example, with a lot of the saturated fat stuff, you had this kind of romantic idea of our evolutionary past, and we would have run around just killing a woolly mammoth and gorging on meat, and so that narrative feeds into what is considered, quote, manly, and what kind of is associated with being a kind of an alpha male. It's like, you eat meat, right? Because that's what. And so I think a lot of those narratives make their way into what people do with their diet. And with the saturated fat and testosterone thing, I think it's very much this idea that, well, saturated fat is found in foods like red meat and stuff. Red meat is a manly food. Therefore, there's this relationship. And then I think who really kind of blew it into the public consciousness was Tim Ferriss in one of his books, when I've always really enjoyed Tim Ferriss's writing, and I have all his books, but the one place I could never just fathom the nonsense out of him was with nutrition claims. And so he has a thing in one of his books where he says he spent 21 days eating nothing but like grass-fed beef. And when he came back, people could smell pheromones off him, and it was all this primal response, and he was healing wounds in like 2 days, and it was just ridiculous kind of claims. So I think he really gave birth to this idea that, saturated fat is correlated with being like, a testosterone fueled red-blooded male. What we know from objective research is that the primary relationship between sex hormones and dietary kind of intake is going to relate to overall energy balance. So whether it's men or women in a protracted state of an energy deficit over time, there is a negative impact on reproductive hormones. And that's simply because we don't have a lot of energy available to us, either in our diet or, in terms of relative to how big the deficit is, how much energy is the body being asked to make up the difference for. And we compensate because our human metabolism is relatively fixed. If we are not getting in a lot of energy to meet our requirements, the body down-regulates other physiological processes that are energy costly, and reproductive function is one of them. So that's the first thing, is the primary relationship between sex hormone production and levels in both men and women. So estrogen and reproductive function in women, and testosterone and reproductive function in men, both correlate to overall energy expenditure and energy intake. So energy balance is the primary determinant there. And then secondarily, there has been some associations in some research looking at kind of energy balance and looking at kind of dietary interventions in a kind of resistance training or sports context, that has suggested that in the context of an energy deficit, a higher percentage of dietary fat may help somewhat attenuate reductions in testosterone levels that occur with dieting. However, I think anyone in physique-oriented sports would probably appreciate that, that's a trade-off. If you're preparing for a show, the priority would be to maintain high training capacity, and that's going to be more achievable for most people with an added amount of dietary carbohydrate. And so when resources in terms of dietary intake become scarce in the context of dieting and an energy deficit, how you economize your macronutrient intake is an important factor. And so the magnitude of attenuation of reduced testosterone from keeping dietary fat higher, for me, is not a big enough effect size to warrant not having more dietary carbohydrate in the diet. You're talking about keeping dietary fat at, say, 30 to 40%, which some people might like to do, and they might be happy with a lower overall amount of carbohydrate. So I think in this context, it's important to say that really it's just a trade-off at that point. But in terms of the actual composition of fat, then, that there's nothing to say that saturated fat is the primary subtype of fat that one would want to preserve testosterone levels. And actually what we have now coming out from a body composition perspective is that a higher level of polyunsaturated to saturated fat intake is associated with favorable reductions in central abdominal fat and visceral adipose tissue. Now, visceral tissue is probably not an issue in most physique-oriented or physique-minded competitors, but there is a suggestion there that optimizing fat subtype balance during a dieting phase may have some sort of a kind of influence on abdominal fat loss and preferential kind of abdominal fat loss. So there's nothing in the research that suggests that saturated fat is essentially required to keep high testosterone levels. Testosterone levels will inevitably drop in the context of protracted dieting or energy deficit. And while there's some suggestion that keeping a higher, up to 40% dietary fat intake in the context of an energy deficit might help somewhat attenuate testosterone levels, I think that really the trade-off there is, do you want to keep slightly higher levels, or which may not be, the magnitude of effect may not be that big, or would you, in terms of setting up a diet for a client, prefer them to have more dietary carbohydrate intake to fuel training? And I think that's very much an individual thing, preference thing, and whatever the coach kind of is minded to do with his individual client.
Yeah, I think you're dead on at that. Like, people often kind of essentially missing the forest for the trees, especially if your goal is, number one, if you're not a physique athlete, you're not going to be dieting down to the point where your hormones are negatively affected. That's just stupid. But if you're in a controlled starvation with some physique competition or whatever, I think, like you said, yeah, you might have slight reductions in testosterone levels, which is going to happen anyway when you get to really lean. But if you're adding in more fat, or say having fat at the expense of less carbohydrates, you probably can't get as much training volume in, which is probably more tightly or closely associated with keeping muscle mass, which is obviously going to be the goal. So you're like, well, I want to keep higher testosterone so I don't lose muscle mass, but then my training is affected, so I can't lift as much, so I'm actually going to lose more muscle through that mechanism rather than through lower testosterone.
Like if you look at the 3D guys,
Yeah.
The way that certainly people like, Alberto Nunez's diet is incredibly low in dietary fat during his contest preps. I think he has about 40 grams a day. And there's no negative implications in terms of his physique prep. Obviously the guy's a phenom. So, that's where the individual preference comes in. And in that particular case, it's a competitor who would rather, once dietary protein intake is taken care of, have the majority of his energy coming from dietary carbohydrates. So,
yeah,
but you might get someone that in terms of with this kind of question, I think it's important to always remind ourselves that actually we're not even talking about what's optimal in terms of like the hormonal stuff or it's also about what do people like eating. Some people might just like eating kind of foods that are fattier foods, right? So, that individual might not want to drop dietary fat as a percentage below, 35% of their energy. And that's totally fine, as long as they're able to sustain a high training output and they enjoy the foods they're eating while they're dieting. I don't think there's any real right or wrong answer here. In fact, there isn't one,
Yeah, I actually tried a couple of years ago. I tried a ketogenic diet, and after about 2 days, I was like, I'm sick of eating like rashers and avocados and red meat. I just need some carbohydrates. But with regards then to, say, what I mentioned earlier, with, it's not necessarily physique contest prep related, but definitely people who are trying to prove their body composition have done this, and I've seen it. It's been probably Tim Ferriss as well. It's probably promoted this, but putting butter in your coffee, or eating coconut oil to try and increase fat burning, or to increase satiety. Is there any issue specifically with increasing your saturated fat intake over and above what it would normally be, and does that make a difference whether you're in a calorie deficit or a surplus, or is it magnified if you're eating an excess amount of calories?
Right. So I think generally, yes, that craze of, you eat fat to burn fat, and that kind of became a real mantra. Again, there's something visceral about people's associations with saturated fat that I've never quite figured out. Eat fat to lose fat as a mantra easily could have translated to people putting, olive oil in their coffee. And I don't know why people didn't do that. But with it manifests as people putting, butter and MCT oil or butter and coconut oil in their coffee. And that we know from a kind of a whole body of evidence that goes back to the 1950s that saturated fats will have the greatest increasing effect on blood cholesterol levels, in particular LDL cholesterol. And so the idea that, putting 2 tablespoons of butter in coffee is a positive, there's no evidence anywhere that could support that intervention, or that nutritional practice will be a good thing to do. So, that craze, I think there was 2 things that came along with it as far as justifications. One was that you increase your cognitive capacity because your brain runs on fats. There's simply no evidence for that whatsoever. We do know that there are certain fats that are vital for cognitive function over the course of the lifespan, but those fats are primarily polyunsaturated fats that are found in oily fish, for example, so long chain omega-3 fatty acids in particular. And then the idea that you would get some sort of increased effect on metabolism, that was more related to the coconut oil or MCT oil element. And you get this very transient effect. They are metabolized differently, but again, the size of the effect is fairly tiny, and it in no way corresponds to any sort of effect that would have you lose more weight. Now, with MCT oil, there is an added potential mechanism for satiety, definitely. It's an understudied area. There is definitely a mechanism by which kind of those short to medium chain fatty acids can induce satiety in people, and so people have less hunger, and there is some emerging evidence to support that. But
would that be compared to say other equivalent amount of calories from other saturated fats or to other macronutrients? So would an equivalent amount of carbohydrates have less of an impact on your hunger theoretically than coconut oil or MCT oil or MCTs? Or was it just comparing saturated fat to another type of saturated fat?
And so that's the thing. In the context of saturated fats, they are unique. The other saturated fats do not behave like that. And so there definitely is not a similar effect. In terms of the research to date, there is no comparable effect with other types of saturated fatty acids. With carbohydrate, you could certainly make a case that an equivalent amount of calories from MCT oil could induce satiety if we were talking about dietary fiber, and particularly soluble fiber and beta-glucan fibers that are found in, for example, oats. And they're highly viscous, and they basically pull in a lot of water when they're in the gut, and that leads to quite a kind of a bulk of bolus food in the gut, and has very strong satiating mechanisms. So yeah, I think if you match that MCT oil with dietary fiber, I don't think anyone's done this study, but my hypothesis would be that actually the dietary fiber has a more satiating effect because of the transit time, whereas MCT fatty acids are metabolized quite quickly. So there is a kind of a satiating effect, but the legacy effect of dietary fiber transit time through the gut would, I think, mean that you get still more of a satiating effect from the
and also things like just the food volume and sensory signals from your stomach expanding, which isn't going to really happen from a tablespoon of coconut oil or MCT. So then, with regards to say saturated fat limits, would you have any recommendations? I know that on a population level, you've posted some stuff before how in Finland. I think it was Finland, right? That the overall increase or decrease in saturated fat was correlated with increase or decreases in, was it heart disease?
Yeah, they had an 80% reduction in heart disease mortality over a 35-year period in Finland, and that occurred in the context of a public health intervention that specifically targeted reducing saturated fat, but specifically butter, which is really interesting given the whole butter and coffee thing. But Finland had the highest level of butter consumption, and it was the primary contributing food to saturated fat in their diet. So their public health intervention deliberately targeted reducing butter intake. And it started in 1972, and 35 years later, they had an 80% reduction in cardiovascular mortality. And when you looked at the various interventions they targeted, one was body weight in the population. That went up. The other was smoking. That really didn't change that much in the population. And then the other was hypertension. And there was a reduction in blood pressure, but the reduction in blood pressure didn't come anywhere near the magnitude of reduction in blood cholesterol levels across the population. And so of the 80% reduction in cardiovascular mortality, the majority, 2/3 of that reduction was associated with reduced blood cholesterol levels. And that was because they managed to get dietary saturated fat at the population level down from 23% to about 12. 12% is give or take where we're sitting at in Ireland and the UK at a population level. Generally speaking, 10% is the threshold that's recommended, and people question that. But if you look at healthy diet patterns, like the Mediterranean diet pattern or the traditional Japanese diet pattern, or these blue zone diets, they're all dietary patterns that are low in saturated fat, and they're not even at the 10% threshold we're looking at in our public health guidance. They're 6, 7, 8%. So I don't see anything wrong with having a high total fat intake, but I think the total body of evidence that we have certainly supports having the majority of your fats from unsaturated fat sources, particularly from fish and plant sources, and having saturated fat come as a byproduct of some animal produce, as it does in the kind of Mediterranean or in the traditional Japanese style diet. So, having a meal of a food that is high in saturated fat is not going to have an adverse effect. So having a steak, having a Sunday lamb roast with the family, like that's not going. What we're talking about in terms of risk between high saturated fat intake and heart disease is a cumulative diet that is total. All of the sum of all the foods in the diet are leading to a high percentage of energy from saturated fat, and then sustaining that kind of dietary pattern over a long term. Yeah.
That's pretty interesting. I didn't know about that. In the Finnish study that the body weight actually went up, because people will typically think, well, yeah, they're overweight, so that's why they have those issues. But their body weight actually went up, and heart disease actually went down. Right. So that's pretty interesting.
And that's why the Finns are the best case study for this, because in the UK population, for example, one of the biggest was that smoking rates from the 1960s were slashed. And so when people talk about, saturated fat is probably not something we need to get people to reduce because we need to focus on body weight and reduce smoking and blah, blah, blah. It's like, you look at the Finns and you're like, well, in that period, no one stopped smoking and everyone's body weight went up. So it's quite strong, a strong support for our current recommendations.
Yeah. I don't know if you've ever been to Finland, but I've been there before, and I've been to the Scandinavian countries a couple of times. People don't actually smoke that much up there. They all chew this thing called snus, which is like this tobacco thing you put in your lip and you look like a rabbit. It's like stinks, but it's strange. It's like smoking is like not frowned upon, but people just don't do it for some reason.
Really?
Yeah, compared to like if you go to like, even I know in continental Europe, like France, they smoke a lot, but
smoke away, don't they?
But even Ireland and the UK, they smoke a lot more than people do in like Norway, Sweden. But snus is like really, really popular. It's this thing you like. It's like a little packet of tobacco or something like nicotine, and you shove it under your gum and it goes into your blood that way. It's horrible, but that's really popular up there. But yeah, going back, it's a bit off topic, but yeah, it's interesting, like I said, because I think like a lot of people that I've surrounded myself with throughout my career, I was a personal trainer a couple of years ago, and people that are quite, say, fit in terms of looking at them, they look physically fit and in shape. They will kind of dismiss that and say, well, it's because people are overweight or fat. Do you think then that even a high energy intake from saturated fat, even if you are, say, somewhat lean, of course it won't be the magnitude probably won't be as high, but do you think it still could lead to some of these complications and issues?
Yeah, one of the things that I kind of became aware of, particularly in the kind of the fitness industry, was that there seems to be this assumption that once you're in an energy deficit and lean, none of the ramifications of what we know about diet and health matter anymore. And I just don't think that, I think that's speculative. Sure, in the short term, weight loss might improve certain metabolic markers. One thing we know about weight loss is that it doesn't really have that much of an impact on blood cholesterol levels. So exercise for cardiovascular health is very much a function of improving cardiorespiratory fitness. But if you with on an average of 10 kilos of weight loss, the reduction in blood cholesterol levels is only like 0.04 millimolar, which basically, is just nothing. So the magnitude of reduction of cholesterol from weight loss isn't that high. And blood lipids will respond to dietary intake acutely, even in the context of an energy deficit. So for me, these principles do still apply. Even if someone was in an energy deficit and lean, there are reasons why you still want the majority of your fats to be unsaturated, oily fish, oil, olive oil, those kind of nuts and seeds, those kind of fat sources. as opposed to purposefully increasing dietary saturated fat intake. Which, one of the things about cardiovascular disease progression is that it can start in your 20s when you're otherwise fit and active. And we know this from some of the Vietnam War autopsy studies, where you were talking about 19, 20, 21-year-old American GIs who, had just come out of playing high school football and were on paper fit and healthy, but had evidence of plaque accumulation in their arteries because of their dietary habits. And so the progression of heart disease is not negated simply by being young and fit. It's a cumulative process that develops over the course of decades. And so dietary practices in your 20s and 30s can influence the process of atherosclerosis at that point, and then influence risk 30 years down the line. So I don't see a reason why we should kind of make exceptions for something, just because at this point in time an individual is training and active and healthy. I think the best practice principles of diet still apply to them as much as they apply to someone that might be, overweight.
Yeah, and I think even in the context of somebody who only really cares about body composition, they don't really put health for now, maybe because they're young, at the forefront. I think it was the study you were referring to earlier. Was that the study where they compared the two different muffins, one which was like saturated fat, one was polyunsaturated fat?
On visceral fat.
Yeah, was that the study? No, have you seen that study lately? I can't remember exactly.
I don't think it was. I'm not
recent.
sure if it was muffin. But there are a number of studies that have all kind of found the same thing.
Yeah, so I can't remember the exact name of the study now, but they basically compared two exactly the same calorie muffins, one which had like 50% of the calories from saturated fat, and the other was 50% of the fat from polyunsaturated fat, and the difference in terms of lean mass gain gain of lean mass ratio to fat mass was significantly different in the polyunsaturated fats. But I guess we need more kind of studies like that.
Yeah, but that would be consistent with what we know about fat kind of metabolism, and now that nutrition science is able to really utilize stable isotope tracer studies, we're able to really precisely track the fate of fatty acids, and well, not just fatty acids, but kind of all foods we eat. So we're not just able to measure the blood response in the hours after a meal like previously. We're actually able to see the flux of a fatty acid through tissues. What tissues does it go into? How long does it go in there for? How long does it come out? And so we're getting very precise analytical methods that are allowing us to show kind of postprandial metabolism or metabolism in the fed state, and that effect of polyunsaturated fat will be kind of, in terms of the body composition element, will be consistent with what's starting to emerge from that. I think I remember someone commenting maybe on this study. Was this in an elderly population?
Yes.
Right.
You're
okay.
correct,
So there's the whole idea of like polyunsaturated fats potentially being beneficial, as well as higher dietary protein intake for age-related sarcopenia and anabolic resistance. But I think in that population, it's always the question is, would that same magnitude of effect occur in otherwise healthy people? I guess that's what we need to see more studies on.
So with regards then to saturated fat from dairy, would you look at that in the same light, or do you look at that differently? I remember reading some research recently on milk. Don't ask me why, but I really got into it and then went down a rabbit hole, and it seemed that there wasn't as much detrimental effects from milk. So whole milk didn't have
yogurt, whole milk yogurts, and so kind of Greek yogurt and stuff, and cheese are three foods within the overall umbrella of dairy that appear to be different. And again, that's to do with the length of their fatty acids are short to medium length, and they're also, when they're in the whole milk form, the dairy fat is enclosed in this membrane called the milk fat globule membrane, and that has signaling potential itself and appears to kind of signal to the liver not to produce as much LDL in response to that particular source of saturated fat. And there are other things, characteristics of these dairy foods that appear to be beneficial for cardiovascular and metabolic health. So they tend to be high in dietary calcium. That might be one reason why dairy foods are quite associated with low rates of blood pressure. And so we see dairy as quite a key component in some of the clinical nutrition intervention diets to reduce hypertension. So that the DASH diet in particular, dietary approaches to stop hypertension. And dairy tends to be it's low salt, it's high calcium, it's high dietary protein, it's satiating. The milk sugars in dairy are beneficial for the gut microbiome, and there could be some interaction there. And then the actual fat in the dairy matrix, if we're talking about milk, whole milk, yogurts, and cheese, is metabolized differently to longer saturated fats that we would find in kind of beef. And then also butter, because in the process of churning to create butter from milk and cream, that protective capsule that's around milk fat is removed. And we have several really nice studies comparing the exact same amount of butter with cheese. So they have the exact same saturated fat amount, but they differ in the type of fat in them. And butter will really drive up someone's cholesterol levels, whereas the cheese will have a fairly neutral effect. So we do know now that these foods seem to have a different impact on blood cholesterol levels. They also seem to have other characteristics of the food matrix that are beneficial for metabolic health, whether it's hypertension or whether it's potentially impacts or interactions with the gut microbiome. And then there's the fact that, I think, to clarify, that this doesn't apply to all dairy foods, because things like butter or lard, I think, or double cream wouldn't necessarily kind of fall into that bracket. But yes, they are. Those foods in particular do seem to be associated with beneficial outcomes. That's not to say that low-fat dairy versions are also not. So there was a nice analysis that looked at both whole milk sources, or what we would call full fat, and low fat sources, and actually they were kind of the same. So people don't have to ditch the low fat versions if they prefer them. It's very much a kind of case of personal preference. But yeah, I think we can somewhat make a case that dairy fats from whole milk yogurts and cheese sources can be distinguished from the kind of wider conversation about overall saturated fat intake.
So swap your butter in your coffee to cheese in your coffee.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
maybe that will catch
brie in your coffee.
Yeah, or perhaps milk. That's probably been done before. So you touched a little bit on sugar there. I know that people who want to improve their body composition, or improve their health as well, often will try and reduce sugar to an absolute minimum, and remove every type of sugar. Do you think that there's any negative impact on your overall health? So from in terms of body composition, it's quite clear that at least in the short term that your body composition is really going to not make much difference once you've kind of made sure you sustained calorie deficit, you have enough protein. But with regards to then health in the long term, do you think that that's important to reduce sugar, both in a calorie deficit and a calorie surplus? And is there any differences when we're talking about, well, reduction in sugar between a surplus and a deficit? Because we kind of have two camps. We have this kind of, if it fits your macros, or you kind of touched on a little bit where like, well, I can eat whatever I want as long as I'm in a deficit. But if people often take that then to heart and they just eat kind of whatever they want and say, well, I'm only in a 200 calorie surplus, so I can kind of eat, 7 Pop-Tarts a day, and they're intaking like 150 grams of sugar. Is there any long-term impacts on your health besides your teeth to do something like that?
So that's a really good question. I mean, I think, yes, you've identified that from a body composition perspective, varying ratios of sugar, are likely, in the context of an energy deficit, not going to negate the the energy deficit. And so, people can obviously lose body fat consuming a high sugar diet. If they're in an energy deficit, the amount of mass they lose is going to be a function of that energy deficit. But with dietary sugars, there's two main kind of ways we tend to look at sugar. We tend to think of it in terms of direct effects and indirect effects. And the direct effect of sugar is, at a population level, is driving increasing body weight. And that's generally because people at a population level consume sugar in added forms, and they don't make compensatory adjustments in energy intake. Now, for most people that are physique-minded, that's not really going to be something they fall into. So that if they're tracking macronutrients and that kind of thing, they're going to have a level of control over their energy balance, whether they're in a deficit or a surplus. The indirect effect of dietary sugar is on underlying processes, particularly liver fat accumulation. And then that precipitates a whole host of kind of potential adverse underlying metabolic issues. And that is something that I think should be considered, particularly if people are in a kind of bulking phase and they're in an energy surplus. So they're in a state where they are going to gain body mass. And if they decide in a kind of flippant IIFYM approach to just consume all the jellies, and they aren't taking care of their dietary fiber intake, and they're having a very high sugar intake as a proportion of energy, again, the fact that they're engaged in resistance training is not necessarily going to attenuate the postprandial responses to a high dietary sugar intake. So if they're in a long-term bulking phase that is going up to kind of maybe 6 months or something like that, and they're insisting on having a huge proportion of their dietary carbohydrate intake in the form of sugar, then these processes of for example, the dose that's needed to have a potential adverse effect on triglycerides is about 50 grams of monosaccharide, of simple sugars. And that's in a postprandial period. So if someone's having a huge proportion of their dietary carbohydrate, and they're in a bulking phase, they're eating something like 600 grams of carbohydrate a day, and they're having, a huge proportion of that from dietary sugars, they're not going to be exempt from the potential for adverse effect on fasting triglycerides and on postprandial triglycerides, the knock-on effects that has on blood cholesterol levels. They're not going to be exempt from the potential for liver fat to accumulate, and then that could potentially drive insulin resistance. They may be somewhat, because if they're resistance training, they may be able to somewhat attenuate the kind of effects of insulin resistance in peripheral and skeletal muscle because of the effect of resistance training on kind of insulin independent glucose uptake. But I certainly don't see a reason why someone, particularly in calorie surplus conditions, with a high dietary sugar intake, would be exempt from these potential, again, and these are underlying issues, right? So this kind of person we're describing may not even notice that they are having these kind of negative effects, and then they kind of get 10 years down the line or whatever, and they suddenly find that they've kind of quite impaired glucose tolerance, and it's because they developed a level of liver fat during the course of kind of chasing the bulk, so to speak.
Yeah.
So I think that, this idea that pendulum swings in nutrition are extreme. So we go from, well, sugar's toxic and everyone starts eating clean. And that really gripped the kind of bodybuilding world and the kind of fitness movement. And then the pendulum swings the other way, as you say, and you've got kind of, if it fits your macros, and well, all I'm going to eat is sugar. And the idea of both extremes is not sound. But certainly the idea that dietary constituents that have potential negative effects don't have negative effects just because someone resistance trains. There's just nothing to really support that.
Yeah. So you mentioned that monosaccharides. So does that mean that because most times people, when they consume sugar, that it might be like a sucrose or something. So does that mean do you double that amount? So 100 grams of sugar,
Yeah.
you think? Is that?
So it's one of the things about the fructose overfeeding studies or sugar overfeeding studies is that they've used monosaccharide fructose or monosaccharide sugars. And generally that's not something we have in the food supply in Europe. And again, one of the things about scientific kind of studies is sometimes we need to understand mechanisms. And the fructose and the sugar overfeeding studies have been useful, but they are mechanistic studies. So they're using doses that are often not seen in the population or that people don't habitually consume. That's not to say people aren't consuming that level. There are subsections that are. But in terms of the relevance of those studies, people often take them and say, oh, well, see, this is a negative effect. And it's like, well, no, you still have to contextualize it. But the reason why the 50 grams is important is because that is what has an effect on postprandial blood lipid responses. And 50 grams a day of a monosaccharide fructose is not beyond the realms of possibility at all if someone is consuming a high total energy intake with a high carbohydrate intake and is also emphasizing a lot of added or free sugars in their diet. So that is something that is very plausible.
Yeah. I mean, I remember when I was like 20 or something like that a couple of years ago, or 8 years ago, but I was pretty heavy. I was kind of, I suppose, delusional in terms of how much muscle I was putting on, but I couldn't get the calories in. So I think every day after I trained, I would literally eat the full bag of Haribo or equivalent, which was probably around 50 grams of fructose, like 100 grams of sucrose, table sugar. So I mean, I definitely wasn't in the best health then, but I guess that's not unusual for a lot of people who are bulking, that they find it hard to eat food or get food in. And I think I want to touch on this in a moment, but when we get to a certain body weight, I know people who are like fitness orientated say BMI isn't that important, but on a population level, obviously is quite important because most people don't have that much muscle mass. But there's a point where, anecdotally, when you're getting very lean, your body starts to fight against you. When you talked about that a little bit, you just don't want to get out of that set point. But the same happens also when you're getting too heavy. You just your appetite slows down. You thought like 10 weeks ago or 10 kilos ago you were going to be able to eat all the food in the world all the time, and then all of a sudden you can't really stomach food anymore. So people start to do these things like liquid calories, even some like bodybuilding supplements or sports supplements like dextrose will be taking like 100 grams of dextrose around their workouts. And dextrose is a monosaccharide, right? That's just the glucose form of glucose, right? But is it specifically fructose, or other monosaccharides as well that can have
fructose does behave slightly differently because it's metabolized by the liver. And so actually your blood glucose response to fructose you don't actually see in the acute kind of 2 hours after a meal. You won't see pronounced impacts on blood glucose the way you do with fructose. And when you look at some of these overfeeding studies, the negative effects on liver fat and on insulin resistance are actually only seen in the fructose overfeeding group and not in the glucose overfeeding group. So there is definitely something specific about fructose metabolism that leads to these kind of adverse effects on liver fat accumulation and the kind of downstream effects of the consequences of increasing liver fat. Again, that is something that we kind of can quite concretely say from the mechanistic studies, but the mechanistic studies don't always mean that the mechanism will happen in real life. It's just giving us an insight. But I do think the 50 grams kind of postprandial response is something that is potentially achievable in kind of people's day-to-day dietary habits if they're kind of just being fairly flippant about their choices.
Yeah, and I think it's important to mention though, just in case anybody thinks that you're not saying that you shouldn't get 2 servings of fruit.
No, not at all. Like that. No, I mean fruit at the end of the day, when you strip it back, I mean mostly fiber and water. I mean the level of fruit that you would have to consume to replicate a dose used in some of these studies is just, I mean, good luck.
You probably need to eat 12 bananas to get 50 grams of fructose, because it's not all fructose and banana, it's glucose as well, right? So If you can do that and you don't puke, then good luck. Um, I actually saw this guy on YouTube before. Just his name is Frank Yang. He's like a YouTuber, and he does like these. He's like a bodybuilder, but he does these stupid eating things, challenges. And he did sprints, and he would like sprint, eat like 10 bananas, and drink 2 liters of milk, and then sprint back, and just kept doing that until he puked. So yeah, pretty stupid.
Yeah.
Pretty stupid stuff.
Yeah.
But final question for you, Alan. I mentioned it a second ago about the pushing your body weight up. Do you think that because often I notice this anecdotally throughout my training career, that people would just assume that I know everything about health and I am the the epitome of health because I weight train. So is there issues specifically with pushing your body weight up even if you are resistance training? Because for the most part, most people are going to be gaining mainly fat when they're gaining body weight, if they're doing it relatively fast or even quite slowly. Can we see issues with regards to that?
Well, yeah, I mean, yes, there is always a consequence to increasing body mass, and while a proportion of that will be lean mass, absolutely. I mean, I think we're talking about the degree of extremity here as well. And if we're looking at the professional bodybuilding ranks, there's obviously a lot more going on in the pursuit of that size, that is concretely going to have adverse effects on cardiovascular and metabolic health. We know that anabolic steroids have quite profoundly negative impacts on cholesterol levels, for example, and lead to like low HDL, high LDL, and this kind of phenotype that's very much associated with heart disease. And you see that with a lot of kind of former bodybuilding greats, is they're getting heart bypasses and have a lot of cardiovascular complications. For your kind of natural training athlete who is simply pursuing that through essentially food and training and supplementation, the level of intake that is going to be required, if that's pursued over time, there is an inevitable negative kind of body composition effect, and you there's only so big you can get with any increase in calories. Only a certain amount of that size is ever going to be lean muscle mass. And so, as you've said, like the consequence of increasing total body mass is a lot of fat mass comes along with that. And again, if someone gets very, very big, they're not going to be independent of the potential downsides of increasing mass and increasing adiposity simply because they're doing a hard chest session once a week, and whatever their training split happens to be. Often in the pursuit of that kind of size, certainly in the bodybuilding world, in the off-season context, what gets sacrificed is any sort of additional cardiovascular work as well, right? So, there's a physical training implication for the pursuit of that kind of size, and then there's also the implication of simply that enormous consumption of calories, and the fact that to fit in that amount of energy over the course of a day means that you have to really extend the amount of time you're in a fed state. What we're really understanding now more in nutrition science is that a lot of the complications that develop for cardiovascular or metabolic disease occur in this fed state. And so people are spending a huge duration of the day in a fed state, constantly processing nutrients, constantly having fat in the blood, glucose in the blood. There are potential consequences to that if that's a practice that's pursued over time. There is not going to be a kind of an independent lack of effect of constantly having high triglycerides and high blood cholesterol levels. And that could be potentially something that if someone doesn't manage, very well over the course of being in the sport for X amount of years, comes back to maybe create some complications later. And I think another thing that is important to bear in mind in that is, when people get to the end of a competitive career and they're kind of just training now for the kind of sake of it, or just the enjoyment of it, there often isn't that kind of compensatory factoring in of like of energy intake. And I can't remember the a couple of the gyms that because I've always trained in like a powerlifting or a weightlifting gym, and you always get the lads there that are still like pulling on all the gear and talking about their diet and stuff, but they're also 50 at this point and they have enormous central adiposity. Now, yeah, they're still lifting, but they haven't evolved their diet with their age, if you know what I mean. And so so you don't get away with a shit diet just because you're lifting weights, basically.
You're spot on with that observation. I see the same thing all the time. Even going to like bodybuilding competitions, and when I see guys who are like I never really followed like bodybuilding in Ireland per se, but when I see guys who are like in their 50s, and like my dad's in his, I think, mid to late 50s, but he runs, so he's in quite good health, but he hasn't got a ton of muscle mass because he doesn't really weight train. But when I see these guys and they're bodybuilders, and you think of a bodybuilder who's like, the sculpture of David, Michelangelo's David, and then it's like, that guy was a bodybuilder. I mean, he looks like he's pretty much obese. Like, yeah, he's a bit big,
right,
but like he's just in terrible shape.
Right.
And like you said, you see the same with like sports stars, who just have an insane diet. And often, like you said, they have that off season and on season kind of dieting and bulking. But once you've kind of finished, you're not really doing that anymore. And the amount of calories that you actually burn through exercises or through weightlifting is relatively small compared to even walking.
Right, exactly. So I think sometimes we can kind of in the physique world, we can really kind of lull ourselves into this false sense of security that, hey, because I lift weights or strength train or resistance train, some of these kind of extra rules don't really apply. And that's, a good diet is a good diet independent of whatever that context of a good diet comes in, whether someone is a endurance athlete or a resistance trained athlete or literally just a punter in the population that doesn't really do any activity. The principles of what we know about diet and health are still applicable, and they're what becomes slightly more subtle in the considerations for the kind of athletic populations there are things like their protein intake, their carbohydrate intake, their fat intake. But fat composition, for example, is still the same for a healthy resistance training, male or female, as it is for someone who potentially is a cardiovascular risk at the age of 50.
Yeah, you don't get out of jail.
You don't get out of jail.
Like get out of jail card.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and that leads me on to this. This is definitely the last question, but I wanted to ask you this one, and that is with the. Is there any long-term implications with having an extremely high protein diet? And when I say extremely high, I mean in the context of what is generally recommended. So like, let's say 2.2 grams or 1 gram per pound of body weight plus, because that's definitely very common in bodybuilding scenes.
Yeah.
And if you're bodybuilding for 20 plus years, that's quite a significant portion of your life. Is there any long-term impact?
So as we know, there doesn't seem to be. What is coming out now and what has been a drum that certain people in the kind of vegan or plant-based community are beating is this idea of IGF-1 being associated with with cancer later in life, and you don't want to have a high dietary protein intake because you'll activate mTOR and IGF-1 and then you'll get cancer. And that's literally the way they're framing it, is like, this is going to happen. I think with anything in science, sometimes it's about weighing up the known knowns versus the kind of unknown maybe. And I find that this emphasis on IGF-1 is a real unknown maybe, because the bottom line is you can have the most perfect diet as far as we know what that means in kind of scientifically and still get cancer, right? Like, as an outcome, it's the most probably random lifestyle disease that we have. And I recoil when I hear people start linking specific foods and mechanisms to diet to cancer, because I think it's a bit irresponsible. But that's a side tangent. With protein, what I'm saying is the known knowns are that a high dietary protein is beneficial for increasing muscle mass. We know that one of the big problems in the elderly is loss of independence. We know that age-related sarcopenia and anabolic resistance are big factors in people as they age losing independence, losing musculoskeletal integrity. And I would rather hedge my bets on having a diet that allows me to preserve lean body mass, preserve musculoskeletal integrity, and preserve, as a consequence, my independence and my physical ability, than worry about IGF-1. So we don't necessarily have any good data that suggests that a high protein diet is detrimental unless you have an underlying kidney disease or condition. We do have emerging evidence supporting higher dietary protein intake, or particularly whey protein, in the elderly as a means to combat age-related sarcopenia. So I don't think I am also I should caveat all of what I'm saying here is I'm also not convinced that I think there's a big difference between saying that a certain level of something is safe versus a certain level of something is actually needed or optimal. And in the sports nutrition world, I think there's been a lot of emphasis on kind of Jose Antonio's research, very much thrown out to the popular mass by the kind of Alan Aragon, Brad Schoenfeld kind of axis of sports nutrition gurus. And I think there's a completely different context of, they're saying, well, this is 4.4 grams per kilo is safe. And it's like, yeah, fine, but who needs 4.4 grams? Like, there's no, there's a difference between saying a high protein intake is safe, which is fine. Is it needed? I can't really see an argument for needing to go kind of, even in a lot of populations higher than, 2.2 grams. I don't see a need for it. And so while I don't think that there are any long-term negative effects, I think that the idea of having excessively high intake, not from a health perspective, but from just a general, what in order to achieve that level of protein intake, what kind of food sources do you need to have to get there? What's missing from your diet potentially in the pursuit of that intake? Yeah. And everything about nutrition is, if there's something high in your diet, what's absent the diet as a result of that? And what I tend to find, and this is a general observation from kind of, having these kinds of conversations, is what tends to go missing when people are really focused on keeping a very high dietary protein intake is fiber. And I think that is where there is a potential negative of a high dietary protein intake, because some of the mechanistic studies from the microbiome research does suggest that if you don't have a high dietary dietary fiber intake and have a high protein diet, that there can be some negative effects on the composition of gut bacteria. And that's something that I think is worth paying attention to. So by all means, have a higher dietary protein intake, but make sure you're getting that 30 grams of fiber a day in whatever you've got to do to get that,
Yeah, I think it comes down to, if someone's trying to bulk and they find it difficult to eat, they're eating protein, which is heavily influenced satiety, and then the same with fiber. They simply can't go get all that food in. So
right.
Well, I'll just leave the fiber out because protein is the most important.
Right.
Right. But I guess it's definitely something to keep in mind. It's not something that even I would have necessarily always thought of the forefront. I kind of think, well, if I'm lifting and I'm doing a little bit of cardio, I can kind of almost get away with it. And it's kind of something that people should think of when they think about long-term context of overall health, because how long is someone really going to be bodybuilding for, and how important is it really at the end of the day if you're not making money from this, and if you are, you're probably doing a lot more things that are a lot more detrimental to your health than consuming higher
exactly.
Yeah. But Alan, it was great to have you on. Thank you so much. You've been a wealth of knowledge. Where can people find out more about you if they want to learn more?
So I have two main sites of kind of communication, well, /3 now. So first is where most people start, which is social media. So you can find me at the nutritional_advocate. And that's always kind of focused on more science kind of communication. I have a website, which is alineanutrition.com, and that's very much focused on kind of breaking down research and increasing kind of critical literacy with nutrition science. So there's a weekly research review, and then there's kind of periodic video lectures and articles. And I also now contribute to Sigma Nutrition, which I'd say most of your listeners know. And we are starting in the last couple of weeks to put out some of that content. We've been doing a series on diet and cardiovascular disease and blood cholesterol levels. So you can find 2 articles that we've produced now on sigmanutrition.com on that. And I'm going to be recording a podcast with Danny addressing a lot of the questions that have come out of that. So that should be out soon enough.
Yeah, and just to kind of jump in on top of that, I think your Instagram, where I found you first, you're definitely a really good advocate for, communicating science effectively, and really good kind of lens on public health as well, which is something that I've only really been interested in before. I know most of the listeners probably are more focused or interested in kind of sport specific nutrition and training, but I remember I posted, I think it might have been a repost of one of your things or something like that. It might be the Marmot report or one of those. And somebody commented, well, poor people are just fat because they're lazy. That's why they're poor and fat. So I was like, but it
makes my brain hurt.
Yeah, but no, it is really interesting if people haven't actually delved into that kind of side of things before, and how different things influence, obesity and poor health, with regards to kind of social economic status, beyond what people think. It's not just always about calories in, calories out. So when you're kind of, even when people say who are listening to this podcast want to communicate nutritional advice or training advice, it's not always as simple for everybody to take on board. And if they can't take it on board, it's not necessarily because they're just lazy or they have poor habits or whatever. It might be an element of it, but not for everybody all the time.
Absolutely.
And then with regards to your website, finally, obviously it's quite new, but I personally am doing the masters, about that, and I found that it's a really good additional resource to explain perhaps how to better read research, because just because something is science and hashtag evidence-based doesn't mean the science is actually any way good at all. So, like a badly published, well, if it's published, it shouldn't be that bad, but a badly published study is often just as bad as a bad article.
Right.
And you've been quite helpful in kind of helping me understand how to read and extrapolate information from studies, rather than just like reading them or reading an abstract and saying, well, this says that, because to be honest, my master's, which I paid thousands for, has been quite shite for that. So I appreciate that. And
thanks, I really appreciate that feedback.
Paid, 10 euros or something.
Yeah, exactly. No, and that's hopefully I'm aiming at people basically like you, as you know, it's kind of aimed at people that are in nutrition as a profession, or work with. So we've a range of people, from dietitians to registered nutritionists to personal trainers, that are all kind of interested in like upskilling on nutrition. And so it's great to hear that it's providing that, because I think a lot of courses that people do, you're learning about the research, but you're not actually learning how to read research. And I think that's a problem.
Yeah. Which is really, really important. I talked to Greg Knuckles about this, the fat-free mass index, in terms of people saying, well, if you have a fat-free mass index over 25, it means you're not natural. But when you actually delve into the research that everybody cites, when you actually look at the research, the sample size was like 50 people who got paid $10 from the area of Boston who had trained for at least 10 or 2 years. And that was the only criteria for inclusion. I mean, are you really, if you want to get the biggest people in the world, you're going to only ask 50 people who train in gyms in Boston. Really?
Right. Yeah, exactly. So, it's over extrapolation.
But again, Alan, yeah, exactly. Thanks so much for coming on, and I really look forward to meeting you in person in later
February.
This month. Next month.
Looking forward to it, man.
Yeah,
Cheers.
appreciate it.
No worries. Chat to you then.
So I really, really enjoyed that conversation. It was definitely something different, not the kind of guest that I would typically have on, but I definitely did want to get Alan on for a while to kind of look at health. Because when we look at bodybuilding or even, you know, training, weight training, and setting up a diet, when people want to lose weight or gain muscle or whatever, we don't really think about health. We just assume that, well, if we lift weights and we are in a calorie surplus or we're building muscle, that means we're just automatically as healthy as possible, or that we're some way, shape, or form immune to, you know, the overall kind of healthy eating guidelines. And while yes, if you do kind of train and work out, etc., you are, I suppose, encapsulated in this kind of shell or, you know, barrier where you're not as prone to get some of these health related diseases or just, you know, abnormalities. However, you know, as people get older, we need to consider, you know, our long-term health. And I guess this is a bigger question. Some of the topics like that we talked about is probably a bigger question for public health in general. And I don't really talk about public health. It's an area that I've kind of started to look at personally, more in depth in terms of how do we actually, you know, battle diabetes, etc. And it's not simply just telling people to, you know, eat less calories or track their macros, because it's not quite that simple. So that's why I really enjoyed speaking to Alan. But I hope you enjoyed listening to this podcast and you picked up some snippets. I definitely did learn a little bit from Alan here that I'm going to be implementing. So if you did enjoy it or you want to ask any questions or anything like that, please do feel free to reach out to either myself or Alan. You get all the details down in the description below. And again, if you want me to continue getting on great guests like Alan, please do leave a rating and review, because it does help with the algorithm to get that podcast up higher. So without further ado, I wish you all the best until the next podcast, and I look forward to chatting to you again.